Everyone remembers their first sleepover, the sleeping bags, the flashlights, the promise that nothing bad ever happens after midnight. Nobody tells you that some houses remember you back, that a place can let you in through the front door and still make you feel, by 2 a.m., like you were never actually invited at all. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through 3 nights I spent under other people's roofs: a girlfriend's apartment where the footsteps came on a schedule, a friend's farmhouse during a thunderstorm where something crossed a hallway with nowhere to go, and a stranger's converted garage I was told, very specifically, never to open. In every single one, I thought I was the guest. By morning, I understood I was something else entirely. Stay until the end, because the last story is the one I still haven't told my own family the full truth about 20 years later. Let's get into it. Story 1. The Woman Who Counted Doors. I want to start by saying I've never believed in anything I couldn't touch. No ghosts, no auras, no spirits knocking on walls. My girlfriend at the time, Marisol, believed in all of it. And for the first 4 months we dated, that was basically our only argument. She'd bring up things like sleep paralysis demons or house energies like they were established science, and I'd sit there nodding along, privately convinced she just liked ghost stories the way some people like true crime. We met a year after I got out of an 8-year relationship that started in college and quietly died the way long relationships sometimes do. Not with a fight, just with 2 people realizing they'd become roommates who loved each other out of habit. Dating again in my late 20s felt like learning to drive a car I used to know how to drive. I downloaded the apps everyone downloads, went on a string of forgettable dinners with women whose names I've already lost, and had mostly given up on the idea that it would feel like anything again. Marisol was different, sharp, funny, allergic to small talk. She worked long shifts at a downtown clinic and had this habit of texting me short, blunt observations about her day that somehow always made me laugh out loud in public. About 6 weeks in, she started asking me to stay over. I kept dodging it, not because of her, but because staying over always felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready to cross yet, some invisible marker of how serious things were getting. She never pushed, except for one thing. She really, really wanted me there on a Thursday. Specifically a Thursday, not a Friday, not a weekend, a random Thursday in the middle of a work week. I asked why that particular night mattered so much, half joking that I hoped it wasn't some elaborate surprise party, and she got quiet in a way I hadn't seen from her before, her eyes dropping to her hands like she was deciding how much of the truth I could handle. She finally told me that for the past month, every Thursday night, something walked through her apartment, not creaked, not settled, walked. Footsteps starting at her front door around 1 a.m., moving down the hallway, pausing outside her bedroom, and then stopping like whoever it was stood there and counted the doors in the hallway before deciding which one to try. She said she'd started sleeping with her desk chair wedged under her doorknob, the way she used to as a kid during thunderstorms. She said some Thursdays the footsteps stopped at her door and just stayed there, unmoving, for what felt like minutes at a time. Other Thursdays, they kept going, further down the hall, toward the guest room she never used because she didn't own a guest bed, just boxes she hadn't unpacked from her last move. I did the thing I always do when I'm uncomfortable. I made it a joke. I told her maybe her upstairs neighbor did laps around his apartment at 1 a.m., some kind of insomniac fitness routine. She didn't laugh. She told me that was the 4th explanation she'd tried to give herself, right after pipes, the building settling, and I'm losing my mind. And none of them held up because pipes don't pause outside a door like they're listening for something. And her upstairs neighbor was a 70-year-old man who used a cane and could not, physically, move that quietly. She also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that it was always exactly 1 set of footsteps. Never 2, never dragging, just steady even, patient steps, like someone who had all the time in the world and no particular reason to hurry. I agreed to stay that Thursday mostly to prove to her, and honestly to myself, that there was a landlord-shaped explanation for all of it. I told myself I'd probably catch a maintenance worker doing a late building walkthrough, or her neighbor's dog, or literally anything with a mundane, forgettable answer. We fell asleep around midnight with the TV still on, her half curled against my shoulder. I remember thinking, right before I drifted off, how normal and boring the apartment felt. Beige walls, a candle that smelled like vanilla, a stack of unread paperbacks on the nightstand. Nothing that belonged in a scary story. I even remember feeling a little smug about it, like I was already halfway to winning our argument before the night was over. I don't know how long I was actually asleep. It couldn't have been more than an hour, because the TV was still playing the same show when I opened my eyes. Just muted somehow. The volume all the way down, though neither of us had touched the remote. The apartment felt colder than it had when we fell asleep, the kind of cold that makes the hair on your arms stand up before your brain catches up to why. I woke up because her hand was digging into my arm hard enough to leave a mark the next day. She wasn't screaming. She was doing something worse. She was completely silent, staring at the door, breathing through her nose like she was trying not to be heard. I heard it before I saw anything, A single footstep, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway outside her bedroom. Then another, then nothing for almost 30 seconds. A silence so complete I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then one more step, right up against the door. The doorknob turned, just slightly, just enough that the little brass latch clicked once and stopped because the desk chair was still wedged underneath it. I want to be honest, every instinct in my body told me to stay exactly where I was and pretend to be asleep. Marisol's grip on my arm told me she'd had the same instinct for a month straight. But I got up anyway, because I needed this to have a face, a name, a landlord, anything. I pulled the chair away before she could stop me and opened the door. The hallway was empty. But at the far end, the guest room door, which we had shut and I distinctly remembered latching earlier that night, stood open about 6 inches, and from inside it I could hear something. Not footsteps this time. Breathing, slow, even patient breathing, like whatever was in there wasn't afraid of being caught, it was waiting to be found. Marisol appeared behind me in the hallway, shaking her head, mouthing, "Don't," but I was already moving. I pushed the guest room door open, flipped the light switch, and the room was empty. Bed made, closet shut, window locked from the inside. Nothing, except the closet door, which I distinctly remember being shut when I flipped the light on, was very slightly open when I turned to leave. 2 inches, maybe less. Just enough to notice. Just enough to make me stop in the doorway and stare at that gap in the dark for longer than I'd like to admit, waiting for something inside to shift, to breathe, to prove I wasn't imagining it. Nothing did. But I couldn't make myself walk over and check, and to this day I haven't fully forgiven myself for that. I backed out of the room instead of turning my back on that closet, which even now feels like an insane thing to admit out loud. I shut the door behind me and told Marisol we were leaving, not going back to sleep, not toughing it out until morning. Leaving. She didn't argue. We didn't sleep the rest of that night. We sat on her couch with every light in the apartment on until the sun came up. Here's the detail that still bothers me more than any footstep. The next morning, over coffee, we were both too shaken to actually drink. Marisol finally told me the rest of what she'd been too embarrassed to say before. That the woman who lived in that apartment before her had moved out with almost no notice, breaking her lease 6 months early despite a hefty penalty fee, and when Marisol asked the landlord why during the walkthrough, he'd gone strangely tight-lipped, just said the last tenant had some trouble sleeping and changed the subject so fast it was obvious he didn't want to say more. Marisol said she hadn't thought much of it at the time. New apartment, good price, why interrogate a landlord about a stranger's reason for leaving? It wasn't until the footsteps started, a few months into living there, that the comment started replaying in her head on a loop. We're married now. We haven't lived in that building in 3 years. But some Thursdays, out of habit, I still find myself lying awake around 1 a.m., listening for a step in a hallway that isn't there anymore. Marisol says she does the same thing. Neither of us has ever said out loud what we're actually listening for. Story 2. The Man in the Coveralls. When I was 16, my best friend Desmond lived out on a stretch of road so rural that our phones lost signal about a mile before you even reached his driveway. We'd been friends since middle school, back when his family lived closer to town, and even after they moved out to the farmhouse his grandfather left them, I was still the one friend who'd make the 20-minute drive out there most weekends, mostly because Desmond had a better gaming setup than anyone else I knew, and his parents didn't care how late we stayed up. His parents traveled a lot for work. His dad did something in agricultural equipment sales that kept him on the road for days at a time, so most of our sleepovers were just the two of us and about 400 acres of dark, empty farmland surrounding the house on every side. That particular October weekend, his parents were in another state for a wedding, and Desmond's older cousin Priya, who was 19 and clearly annoyed about the assignment, was technically watching us, which mostly meant she stayed in her room on the phone with her boyfriend while we played video games downstairs until 2 a.m. Neither of us minded. We had the whole downstairs to ourselves, a fridge full of snacks Desmond's mom had stocked before leaving, and zero adult supervision to speak of. Around 11 p.m., the power flickered once, came back, then died completely. Not unusual out there. A bad storm was rolling through, thunder rattling the windows every few minutes, and Desmond said this happened at least twice a month during storm season. He wasn't worried at all, which put me at ease more than anything else could have. We lit a couple of candles from a junk drawer in the kitchen, grabbed flashlights from the hallway closet, and kept playing cards by candlelight, laughing about how much it felt like camping, our voices echoing a little louder than usual in a house that suddenly felt much bigger without the hum of the refrigerator and the TV filling the silence. That's when the motion light over the barn, visible through the kitchen window, clicked on. Desmond's family didn't have close neighbors. The nearest house was almost a mile down the road, and the barn light was motion activated specifically because deer set it off almost every night. Desmond said normally it clicked on, stayed lit for maybe 10 seconds, and clicked back off once whatever animal wandered out of range. So when that light snapped on and just stayed on, minute after minute, we both went quiet and walked to the window without saying anything to each other. Standing at the edge of the barn, half lit by that harsh white motion sensor glow, was a man in dark coveralls, not moving, just standing there, facing the house, like he'd been standing there for a while and we'd simply arrived late to notice him. He was too far to make out a face, just a shape, broad shoulders, coveralls that looked almost too dark to be normal work clothes, arms hanging still at his sides. Desmond said maybe it was a neighbor whose car broke down, or one of the seasonal farm hands his dad sometimes hired during harvest, checking on the equipment. I said maybe. Neither of us believed it, and neither of us could explain why someone with a legitimate reason to be there would just stand still in the dark instead of walking up to the house. We went and got Priya, who peeked through the window, squinted for a second, told us it was probably nothing, and went back to her room. But I noticed she locked her door on the way in, something I'd never once seen her do in all the times I'd stayed over, and she left her phone light on under the door for the rest of the night. We watched the man for almost 10 minutes. He never moved, never waved, never approached. Then all at once, the motion light clicked off, even though he hadn't moved a muscle to leave its range. And when it clicked back on half a second later, he was gone. Not walked away. Gone. There was no tree line close enough, no shed, nothing he could have reached in half a second of darkness. Desmond grabbed his dad's old aluminum baseball bat from the coat closet, which somehow made both of us feel worse instead of better, because it meant we both silently agreed this was a bat-necessary situation. We didn't sleep in his room that night. We dragged our sleeping bags into the hallway outside Priya's door where there were no windows, and left every light we could find turned on despite the power being out, flashlights propped against the walls like little sentries. Around 1:30 a.m., we heard it. Not footsteps outside, footsteps inside. Slow, heavy, deliberate steps coming from the mudroom just off the kitchen, the one door in the house that led directly outside from ground level. No porch, no steps, nothing to climb. Desmond swore he'd locked that door himself before the power went out. I believed him because Desmond was the kind of overly cautious kid who triple-checked locks out of habit. The footsteps crossed the kitchen tile, stopped, then started again, coming toward the hallway where we were sitting, frozen with a baseball bat between us like it was a campfire. I want to tell you we did something brave. We didn't. We sat completely still, flashlights aimed at the hallway entrance, and waited. A shape crossed the end of the hallway, just for a second, just a silhouette passing left to right in the dark, wearing what looked like the same dark coveralls from the barn. It didn't look at us. It didn't slow down. It walked past the hallway entrance like it had somewhere specific to be inside a house it had never been invited into and disappeared toward the staircase. I remember the strange detail that stuck with me for years afterward. I never heard a single footstep once it crossed into view. The heavy steps we'd heard crossing the kitchen tile just stopped being audible the second it entered our sight line, like the sound and the shape belonged to two different things that happened to be moving together. Nobody said a word for almost a full minute after that. We just sat there, three teenagers in a dark hallway, listening for anything, a floorboard, a stair creak, breathing, anything, and hearing absolutely nothing at all, which was somehow worse than the footsteps had been. Priya's door flew open behind us, phone flashlight already up, face pale in a way I'd never seen on someone that much older and supposedly more in control than us. She'd heard it too. She grabbed her phone and tried calling 911 despite the dead signal, getting nothing but a single bar that dropped the call twice before she gave up. The three of us sat pressed against the wall in that hallway with the bat, the flashlights, and absolutely no plan, whispering theories to each other that all sounded ridiculous out loud and terrifying in the silence between sentences, until sunrise finally broke through the kitchen window and the house looked exactly like a normal farmhouse again. Mudroom door locked tight from the inside exactly the way Desmond swore he'd left it the night before. Desmond's parents got home 2 days later. When his dad heard the story, his face did something I'll never forget. He went pale, sat down at the kitchen table, and told us that the farmhouse had a caretaker back in the 80s who died on the property in his work coveralls, and that the family who'd owned the land before them had mentioned it once, half joking, when they closed on the sale, and he'd never brought it up because he didn't want to scare Desmond. Desmond's dad tried to laugh it off after that, tried to turn it into a story he'd tell at dinner parties. But I noticed he had a second deadbolt installed on that mudroom door within the month, and I noticed the motion light over the barn got swapped out for a brighter one not long after that too, like he wanted fewer shadows to hide in, even if he never said that out loud. We never found out who or what walked past us that night. What I know is that the mudroom door was locked. What I know is that whatever crossed that hallway had somewhere to be, moved with purpose, and didn't so much as glance toward the two teenagers frozen against the wall with a baseball bat between them. And 7 years later, I still won't sleep in a house with a door that leads straight outside without at least one lock between me and it. And I still think about that half second of darkness between the motion light clicking off and clicking back on, and how much distance a person would need to cover to disappear that fast, and how there wasn't nearly enough of it. Story 3. The room behind the green door. I was 11, new to a school in a town my family had just moved to halfway through the year, and the only kid who didn't immediately treat me like an outsider was a quiet boy named Theo, who lived 2 streets over. Everyone else already had their friend groups locked in since kindergarten, tight little cliques that had no room for a new kid who didn't know any of the inside jokes. Theo was an easy target for the same reason, minus the new part. He was awkward, dressed a little out of step with everyone else, wore the same faded jacket most days, and had a habit of talking about niche hobbies nobody else cared about, which happened to be old horror radio dramas, something I was secretly obsessed with too, thanks to my grandfather's old cassette collection. We bonded fast, in the quiet way 2 outsider kids do, over lunch, in the hallway between classes, comparing notes on episodes neither of us thought anyone else on Earth had heard of. His mom called my mom one afternoon and asked if I could sleep over that Friday since Theo didn't have many friends and she thought it'd be good for him to have someone over for once. My mom, always eager for me to make friends in a new town, said yes before I could even weigh in. Theo's house was normal from the outside. Small, tidy, a basketball hoop nobody used bolted above the garage, a welcome mat that said something cheerful about coffee. His stepdad answered the door, a big cheerful man named Rowan with a booming laugh who immediately started talking about a wall of old reel-to-reel tape recordings he collected, which lit Theo up in a way I hadn't seen at school. Rowan asked me all kinds of questions about my old town, my favorite subjects, whether I liked pizza, in this warm, overeager way that reminded me a little of a substitute teacher trying too hard to be liked. Dinner was pizza, eaten at a kitchen table with mismatched chairs. Everyone was warm and normal, and a little corny in a way that made me relax, made me forget I'd been nervous about the sleepover at all. As his parents headed to bed around 10, Rowan told us we could stay up as late as we wanted, watch whatever we wanted, eat whatever we found in the fridge, as long as we didn't go into the converted garage off the kitchen, which he used for work stuff that wasn't safe for kids to be around. Chemicals, he said, vague and quick, already turning to head upstairs before either of us could ask a follow-up question. Theo nodded like this was completely normal, something he'd clearly heard 100 times before, so I let it go and didn't think about it again for hours. We stayed up talking about radio dramas until almost 1 a.m., and then Theo finally crashed. I couldn't. New house, new bed, that specific kind of quiet that only exists in someone else's home. Around 2 a.m., I heard Rowan come downstairs. Soft footsteps, a door opening, not the garage door, a different door, off a short hallway near the kitchen, and closing behind him. A few minutes later, I heard a low hum start up, like old electronics warming up, and beneath it, something that sounded almost like a recording playing muffled voices, a rhythm that wasn't quite music and wasn't quite speech. It went on for nearly an hour before it stopped, and Rowan came back upstairs. The next morning, Rowan made pancakes like nothing had happened, cracking jokes completely himself. Over breakfast, he mentioned he had a full archive of old radio broadcasts on reel-to-reel in the workroom, the room behind that door near the kitchen, and told Theo he could show me some of it later since I'd clearly caught the same bug he had. He left for a few hours to run errands. That's when Theo, buzzing with excitement, suggested we peek into the workroom ourselves, just for a minute, before his stepdad got back. I asked if that was allowed. Theo hesitated, then said his stepdad was probably just being overprotective about his equipment, and it wasn't like we'd break anything. The room was small, windowless, lined with shelves of labeled reels, dates, event names, radio station call signs, all neatly organized in a system that looked almost professional. Against the far wall sat an old reel-to-reel player, dust-free, clearly used recently, its dials worn smooth in the places a thumb would rest. Most of the reels were meticulously labeled in careful block handwriting, but tucked among them on the bottom shelf, half hidden behind a stack of ordinary ones, were 3 unmarked reels with nothing but a strip of masking tape that said A, B, and C. Everything else in that room was cataloged down to the date, the station, sometimes even the weather that day. These 3 weren't. No date, no name, nothing. Theo noticed them at the same time I did and went quiet in a way that made me think he already knew they were there and had been hoping I wouldn't find them. That's what made me reach for reel B. Not curiosity exactly, more like the specific kind of dread that makes you need to know instead of walk away. I threaded it onto the player before Theo could stop me, my hands moving faster than my better judgment could catch up to. The reels started spinning with a mechanical click, and for a second there was nothing but the hiss of blank tape, and I remember feeling almost disappointed, like maybe it really was just some boring backup recording after all. Then the static thickened. What came out of the speaker wasn't a radio drama. It was static laced with a low rhythmic breathing sound close to the microphone, deliberate in a way that didn't sound like an accident, and underneath it, very faint, what might have been someone counting, slow, flat, emotionless numbers, climbing higher and higher with no apparent reason to stop, no rhythm that matched anything I could recognize. Then a voice, closer to the microphone than anything else on the tape, said clearly, "You're not supposed to be listening to this one yet." Theo lunged past me and yanked the plug from the wall so fast the reel spun off its spindle. We stood there in silence until we heard tires on the gravel driveway outside and bolted back upstairs, hearts pounding, saying nothing to each other about what we'd just heard. Rowan came in cheerful as always, said hello, went to put groceries away. About 20 minutes later, I heard him go into the workroom. There was a long silence. Then his footsteps came back down the hallway toward the living room, and when he appeared in the doorway, his whole demeanor had changed. Flat, cold, nothing like the man who'd made us pancakes that morning. He told me very calmly that it was time for my parents to pick me up. He didn't yell. He didn't ask what we'd done, or how much we'd heard, or which reel we'd touched. He already knew, all of it, without asking a single question, which somehow felt worse than if he'd screamed at us. My mom came to get me an hour later, confused about the early pickup, and I made up something about not feeling well because I genuinely could not find the words to explain what had actually happened, even to myself. Theo wasn't at school the following Monday, or the Monday after. About 2 weeks later, our teacher told the class Theo's family had moved out of state suddenly for his stepdad's job. I walked past his house on the way home that same week, and it already had a for sale sign in the yard, curtains gone, driveway empty, like the family had been erased overnight. I never told anyone what the tape said, mostly because I didn't understand it and didn't want to think about it too hard. It wasn't until years later, telling this story to a friend studying broadcast history, that she went pale and asked me to describe the room again. The unmarked reels, the labeling system, the countdown. She told me there are documented cases of private, unlicensed archives, recordings never meant for broadcast, exchanged quietly between collectors who trade in things far darker than old radio dramas. I didn't want to know more, and I still don't. I've looked for Theo a few times over the years. No social media, no yearbook mentions past that spring, nothing. Just a for sale sign and an unmarked reel labeled B that I still, 20 years later, sometimes hear in my head, that flat voice telling me I wasn't supposed to be listening yet, and wondering if I hadn't stopped it in time what exactly I would have heard next.